When a 96-year-old man stepped into a courtroom to contest a speeding ticket he didn't deserve, no one thought much of it at first, but what happened next would leave the entire room in stunned silence, revealing a story of unwavering love, sacrifice, and a father's unbreakable bond with his son. Before we dive into this touching story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of family resilience, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire. The first rays of sunlight crept into the kitchen, casting a warm golden hue across the modest room. William Hartman stood by the counter, methodically buttoning his shirt with deliberate precision. His hands, whether from decades of hard work, moved slower these days, but they were steady. He glanced briefly at the clock on the wall. It's ticking, a familiar companion during his quiet mornings. The hospital visit was on his mind, as it always was, but he didn't rush. Everything about William's routine was calm, thoughtful, and practiced. At the table sat his son Mike, cradling a steaming mug of coffee in both hands. His thin fingers trembled slightly as he sipped, but his expression remained calm. At 62, Mike had become used to these hospital trips. They were as much a part of his life now as the illness he fought against. His pale complexion and sunken cheeks betrayed his condition, but he held himself with quiet dignity. William moved toward the stove, where a second mug waited, filled with black coffee, just the way he liked it. He settled into his usual chair, sighing, as he leaned his cane against the table. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of Mike's spoon against the ceramic mug. "You sleep all right?" William asked. His voice gruff but gentle. Mike nodded, setting the mug down. "Yeah, pretty well." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but neither pressed the matter. There was no point in dwelling on sleepless nights when the day ahead already promised its shared challenges. William's gaze drifted to the kitchen counter, where a framed photograph sat prominently next to an old recipe box. It was a picture of Eleanor, his late wife, with a much younger Mike on her lap. Her smile was radiant, her arms wrapped tightly around their son. William's lips tightened into a thin line as the memory of her voice filled his mind. "Don't worry, William," she had always said, even in the toughest moments. "We'll figure it out. We always do." Her absence was a wound that never fully healed, but it also fueled his determination. As he stared at the photo, he could almost hear her soft laughter, her unwavering encouragement. She would have wanted him to stay strong. For Mike, "You ready, Pop?" Mike's voice broke the silence, pulling William for his reverie. William blinked, looking back at his son. "Yeah, just about." He grabbed his cane and stood, his movements deliberate. As they made their way to the door, William paused, glancing at the photo one last time. His eyes lingered on Eleanor's face, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself the comfort of her memory. The old sedan groaned as William opened the driver's side door. It was a relic of a different era, its beige paint chipped and dull by years of use. The interior smelled faintly of leather and motor oil, a mix that Mike found oddly comforting. As William eased himself into the driver's seat, he took a moment to adjust the mirror, glancing at his reflection. "You good, Mike?" he asked, his eyes flicking to his son in the passenger seat. Mike fastened his seatbelt with a faint smile. "I'm good." Pop the engine sputtered before roaring to life, and the car eased out of driveway, tires crunching softly against the gravel. They drove in companionable silence, the streets quiet in the early morning. As they passed familiar landmarks, the corner store, the park where Mike used to play, the bakery where Eleanor once bought their favorite pastries, William Corner Store, the park where Mike used to play, the bakery where Eleanor once bought their favorite pastries. William's grip on the wheel tightened slightly. Each place was a reminder of a life that felt both distant and near, tied together by the steady pulse of time. "You remember the time Mike tried to bake that chocolate cake?" Mike asked suddenly, breaking the silence. William chuckled, a rare sound that filled the car. "She burnt the first one and blamed the oven, and then made me eat the second one, even though it was still half raw," Mike added, grinning. William shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "She loved that oven like it was part of the family. Wouldn't let me replace it no matter how many times it broke." The memory brought a brief warmth to the otherwise somber ride. It was moments like these, small, shared memories, that kept them going. As they approached the edge of town, the streets grew quieter, the hum of the car engine the only sound. William's eyes darted to the dashboard, checking the time. They were running slightly behind schedule, and the hospital was still a few miles away. "You think we'll make it on time?" Mike asked, his tone casual but his eyes betraying his worry. William nodded firmly. "We'll make it. Don't you worry about that." As the car rolled onward, the sunlight grew brighter, casting long shadows across the road. Mike leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. He trusted his father, not just with the drive, but with everything. No matter how tough things got, William had always been there, steady, unwavering. William glanced at his son, his expression softening. "Hang in there, Mike," he murmured under his breath. The sedan hummed steadily down the road, its old engine producing a rhythm that matched the quiet atmosphere in the car. William Hartman's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles faintly pale against his weathered skin. He drove, carefully, never in a rush. There was no place for haste in his routine. Mike sat beside him, leaning his head back against the seat, his eyes half closed. The silence was broken by the sharp wail of a siren. William's heart jolted, and his foot instinctively eased off the gas. He glanced into the rear-view mirror, catching the glare of red and blue lights flashing behind him. "Is that for us?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. William frowned, his brow furrowing, as he steered the car to the side of the road. "Looks like it," he muttered. The police cruiser pulled up behind them, its lights continued to spin in an almost accusatory rhythm. William rolled down his window, the cool morning air rushing in as the officer approached. A young man in a crisp uniform stood outside, his face impassive. "Sir, do you know why I stopped you?" William adjusted his glasses, his confusion evident. "No, officer, I don't. You were speeding to a school zone," the officer stated flatly, pulling a notepad from his pocket. William blinked in disbelief. Speeding at William, and he looked at William. "Miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. I'll need your license and registration." William's hands moved to the glove compartment, his movements slow and deliberate. "Look," he said, his tone steady but pleading, "I'm on my way to the hospital with my son. He's very sick, and I'm doing my best to get him there safely." Mike leaned forward, his pale face tinged with frustration. "Officer, I have leukemia. We're not trying to cause trouble. We're just trying to get to my appointment." The officer hesitated for a brief moment, his eyes darting toward Mike before returning to William. "I understand that, but the law is the law," he said, his tone firm. "Speed limits are there for a reason." William sighed, his grip tightening on the registration papers as he handed them over. "I'm 96 years old," he said, his voice tinged with quiet incredulity. "Do I look like the type to be speeding around recklessly?" The officer didn't answer. He turned and walked back to his cruiser, leaving William and Mike in tense silence. "This is ridiculous," Mike muttered, his voice laced with frustration. William reached over, resting a hand on Mike's arm. "Calm down, Mike. Getting upset won't help." Mike exhaled sharply, leaning back in his seat. "I just hate this," he said, his voice cracking. William said nothing, his gaze fixed on a rear-view mirror as the officer returned. The young man handed back William's documents along with a freshly written ticket. "Here's your citation, sir," the officer said. "You can contest in court if you believe there's been a mistake." William took the ticket, his fingers trembling slightly. His calm demeanor remained intact, but frustration simmered just below the surface. "Thank you, officer," he said quietly, though the words fell hollow. Mike couldn't hold back anymore. "You're really good at giving him a ticket. Look at him. Look at me. Does this seem fair to you?" The officer's expression remained neutral. "I'm just doing my job." William placed a hand on Mike's shoulder, silencing him with a gentle squeeze. "It's okay, son," he said softly. "Let's just go." The officer nodded curtly and walked back to his cruiser. William started the car again, the engine sputtering to life. As they pulled back onto the road, he glanced over at Mike, whose breathing had grown more labored. "You all right?" William asked, to concern evident. Mike nodded, but his expression was strained. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired. William didn't respond, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. The ticket sat on the dashboard, a stark reminder of the precious minutes they had just lost. For the first time in years, William felt a flicker of anger, not just at the officer, but at the unfairness of it all, the sickness that had robbed Mike of his vitality, the weight of responsibility that grew heavier with every passing year. He forced himself to breathe deeply, focusing on the road ahead. They were close to the hospital now, and that was all that mattered. As the cityscape came into view, William glanced at his son again, his heart aching at the sight of him. No matter how hard things got, he would keep going. For Mike's sake, he had to. The flashing lights in the distance faded from view, but the sting of the encounter lingered in the air. Would you have issued the ticket to William if you were the officer? Comment down below and like the video if you're eager to find out what happens next. Let's continue. The sliding doors of the hospital hissed open, welcoming William and Mike into a familiar world of sterile corridors and muted sounds. The sharp smell of disinfectant hung in the air, mingling with a faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby kiosk. William moved steadily, his walking stick tapping against the floor as Mike walked beside him, his steps slightly uneven but determined. "Good morning, Mr. Hartman," a nurse greeted with a warm but subdued smile. Her name tag read Emily, and her eyes were kind. "Morning," William replied, tipping his head slightly. He was a regular here, though not by choice. Emily's gaze shifted to Mike. "How are we feeling today, Mike?" Mike managed a weak smile. "The same, but hey, still here. We're ready for you," she said with quiet encouragement before gesturing to a technician waiting nearby. "They'll take you back now." Mike nodded and turned to his father. "I won't be long, Pop." William reached out and gave his shoulder a firm squeeze. "I'll be right here, Mike." As Mike disappeared to a set of double doors, William shuffled to the waiting area. He chose a seat by the window, away from the television blaring an early morning talk show. The sunlight streaming to the glass fell across his lap, highlighting the deep lines of his hands as they gripped the handle of his walking stick. The noise of the hospital began to fade into the background, the faint hum of conversations, the distant beeping of monitors. William's thoughts turned inward, drawn back to a time before the hospital visit, before the illness that had stolen so much of Mike's life. He closed his eyes, and a vivid memory came to him. Mike was 5 years old, darting around their small backyard with boundless energy. Eleanor stood near the porch, her laughter ringing out as she cheered him on. "Faster, Mike. You've almost got him," she called, clapping her hands. William was the one being chased, though he quickly realized he was no match for the exuberant boy. He had stumbled and collapsed into grass, laughing breathlessly as Mike tackled him with glee. "You're getting slow, old man," Eleanor teased, her eyes sparkling as she came to join them. She bent down, wrapping an arm around Mike and ruffling his hair. "I let him win," William had replied, grinning up at her. "Gotta build his confidence." Eleanor had just shaken her head, smiling as she leaned in to kiss him on the forehead. "You're hopeless." The warmth of that moment lingered as William sat in the hospital waiting room, his grip on the walking stick tightened, the joy of a memory colliding with the ache of the present. Eleanor wasn't here anymore to share these burdens, and Mike's laughter had grown quieter, more fragile. "Eleanor," he whispered under his breath, his voice barely audible, "give me strength, just a little more, for our boy." A sharp clatter nearby broke his reverie. He opened his eyes to see a nurse dropping a stack of clipboards onto the counter, her face flushed with mild embarrassment. Around in the hospital bustled on, oblivious of the weight he carried. William leaned back in his chair, his gaze wandering to the other families in the waiting room. A young mother bounced a fussy toddler on her knee, her face drawn with exhaustion. An elderly couple sat nearby. The woman rested her head on her husband's shoulder as he rubbed her back soothingly. It was a room full of quiet battles, each person holding their own private fears and hopes. He glanced at the clock. 20 minutes had passed, though it felt much longer. His thoughts drifted back to Mike's early days of treatment, the shock of the diagnosis, the long nights sitting by his son's hospital bed, the unwavering determination to stay strong for him. He remembered Eleanor's voice during those early days, always steady, always reassuring. We'll get through this, William, she had said, her hand resting over his, one step at a time. He wished he could hear her voice now, even just for a moment. Mr. Hartman, the sound of his name startled him, and he turned to see Emily standing nearby. Yes, he said, sitting up straighter. Mike's done. He's in recovery and ready to go home. William exhaled, a mix of relief and fatigue washing over him. Thank you, he said, rising slowly. He followed Emily down the corridor, his cane tapping softly with each step. When they reached the small recovery area, Mike was sitting upright in a chair, his color still pale, but his eyes brighter than before. Hey, Pop, Mike said, managing a faint smile. William's lips twitched into a small grin. You look better already, he said, his voice tinged with quiet pride. Still kicking, Mike quipped, his tone light but sincere. William walked over and placed a steadying hand on Mike's shoulder. Let's get you home, he said, his tone firm but gentle. As they made their way out of the hospital, William felt the weight on his shoulders ease slightly. For now, they had made it through another day. The old sedan hummed along the quiet streets, its engine a steady companion in the silence that filled the car. William kept his eyes on the road, his grip firm on the wheel, though his body ached with the weariness of the day. Beside him, Mike leaned against a window, his head resting on the cool glass. The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the trees, casting shifting shadows across the dashboard. Mike shifted slightly, breaking the stillness. Pop, you okay? William glanced over briefly, his lips curving into a small smile. I'm fine, Mike, just keeping us on the road. Mike nodded, his pale face calm, but tired. He didn't press further, knowing his father wouldn't admit to being tired, even if he were. Instead, he let the silence return, only broken by the faint tapping of William's walking stick against the floor, keeping time with the car's gentle sways. As they neared their neighborhood, familiar sights passed by. The old grocery store where Eleanor used to shop, the church where they once attended Sunday Sir Williams as a family, the park where Mike played as a boy. William's chest tightened at each memory, but he kept his eyes ahead, focusing on the road. When they finally pulled into driveway, the sedan gave its customary groan as William shifted into park. He turned off the engine, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Thanks for everything today, Pop, Mike said quietly, breaking the stillness. His voice carried a mix of gratitude and concern, as though he wanted to say more, but didn't know how. William waved a hand dismissively as he reached for his cane. It's what fathers do, he replied with a small laugh, his tone light but steady. Mike smiled faintly. Still, I appreciate it. William nodded, opening the car door with a slow, deliberate motion. Come on, let's get inside before the mosquitoes have us for dinner. The house greeted them with its familiar warmth, though it carried an unmistakable stillness that always struck William when they returned from hospital. Mike went straight to the living room, sinking into his favorite armchair with a sigh of relief. You hungry? William called from the kitchen as he placed his cane against the counter. Not really, Mike replied, though the weariness in his voice didn't escape William's notice. William chuckled softly as he rummaged through the fridge. You gotta eat something, Mike. I'm not letting you get away with skipping dinner. Eventually they settled for a simple meal, reheated soup and buttered bread. The clinking of their spoons was the only sound in the kitchen, punctuated by occasional glances exchanged between father and son. Mike finally broke the silence. Pop, you don't have to keep doing this, you know. William paused mid-bite, looking at his son with a raised eyebrow. Doing what? All of it, Mike said, his voice hesitant. Driving me, waiting at the hospital, taking care of me. You've done enough already. William set a spoon down carefully, his expression unreadable. Enough, he said slowly. Mike, as long as I got breath in me, it'll never be enough. You're my son. That's what fathers do. Mike's gaze dropped to his bowl, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. I just don't want to be a burden, he murmured. William's voice softened. You're not a burden, Mike. Don't ever think that. We're in this together, just like we've always been. The conversation lingered in the air, unspoken feelings hovering between them. Mike eventually nodded, a small but grateful smile playing at his lips. After dinner, William began clearing the table While Mike retreated to his room, the clatter of dishes in the sink echoed through the house, a small but comforting sound. When the kitchen was clean, William made his way to his bedroom, his movements slow and deliberate. As the day's exhaustion caught up to him, he lowered himself onto the edge of bed, his cane resting against the nightstand. His eyes fell on a photograph framed beside the lamp. Eleanor, her radiant smile frozen in time. William reached for it, his fingers brushing the edge of the frame as though he could feel her presence. "We made it through another day, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I hope you're proud." The room was quiet, save for the faint creak of the old house settling. William closed his eyes, holding the photograph close for a moment longer before setting it back in its place. As he lay back against the pillows, his body heavy with fatigue, his mind turned to the promise he'd made so many years ago. No matter how tired he felt, no matter how hard the days became, he would keep going. For Mike, for Eleanor, for the family they had built together. The house settled into silence as the night deepened, and for a brief moment William allowed himself the solace of rest. He had done enough for today. Tomorrow he would do it all over again. The day had been uneventful until the evening, when William, distracted by his own thoughts, made a small but costly mistake. As he stepped into the kitchen, his slipper caught the edge of the rug. The sudden imbalance sent him sprawling to the floor, a sharp jolt of pain shooting through his leg. "Pop!" Mike's voice came from the living room, alarmed and urgent. William gritted his teeth, trying to sit up, but the pain in his lower leg made him freeze. "I'm fine, Mike," he managed, though his voice lacked contact on William. Mike appeared in the doorway, his pale face growing even paler, as he took in sight of William on the floor. "You're not fine," he said firmly, grabbing his phone. "I'm calling for help." William started to protest, but the pain silenced him. A few minutes later, the familiar wail of an approaching ambulance filled the air. The paramedics arrived quickly, their movements efficient. As they assessed William's injury, "It looks like you fractured your leg, sir," one of them said gently. "We'll need to get you to the hospital for x-rays." William sighed, the frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. He allowed himself to be helped onto the stretcher, his grip on Mike's hand firm. "Don't worry, Mike," he said quietly. "It's just a small bump in the road." Mike nodded, though his worry was evident in his furrowed brow. At the hospital, the doctor confirmed the paramedic's assessment of fractured tibia. "You'll need to wear a cast and stay off your leg for at least a week," the doctor said, his tone professional but kind. William's heart sank. The court date was in just a few days, and the idea of hobbling into the courthouse with a cast was far from ideal. Still, he knew he had no choice but to follow the doctor's orders. "That's going to be hard to do," William muttered. "You'll manage," Mike said from his chair beside the bed. His tone was firm, but laced with concern. "You've been taking care of me all this time. Now it's my turn." William looked at his son, his expression softening. "Mike, you've got enough on your plate. I don't want to be another thing for you to worry about." Mike shook his head. "Pop, you've done more for me than I could ever repay. Let me take care of you for once." William didn't argue further, though the shift in roles left him feeling uneasy. The next few days were a challenge. Mike did his best to help, fetching meals, adjusting pillows, and even insisting on doing the dishes, a task William usually claimed as his own. Though grateful, William couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. He had always been the caretaker, the steady hand guiding his family through every hardship. Now, watching Mike shuffle through the house with his own labored steps to assist him, William felt a mix of pride and guilt. "Pop, stop staring," Mike joked one afternoon, catching William's gaze as he carried a tray of tea to the living room. William chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm just not used to seeing you running the show. You're doing a fine job." Mike smirked, setting the tray down. "Don't get too comfortable. You'll be back on your feet soon enough." As the court date approached, William became increasingly restless. He knew he couldn't miss it, not for himself, and certainly not for Mike. On the morning of the hearing, he sat on the edge of his bed, carefully pulling on his neatly pressed button-down shirt. Mike entered the room, his steps slower than usual, but steady. "You sure you want to do this, Pop? You could ask for a delay." William shook his head. "No, I need to see this through. I promised your mother I'd always stand up for us, and I'm not breaking that promise now." Mike nodded, his respect for his father evident in his expression. William chose his tweed jacket, one of the few garments in his wardrobe that still carried a sense of formality. He paired it with dark slacks, which he managed to fit comfortably over his cast. His polished leather shoes, which he typically wore for such occasions, had to be replaced with a simple black slipper on his injured foot. Standing in front of the mirror, William adjusted his glasses. Taking his reflection, the cast and walking stick gave him an almost comical appearance, but his expression was resolute. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice low, "I hope I don't embarrass myself today." Mike, hearing him smile faintly, "You're gonna do great, Pop. You always do." William turned to his son, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "Let's get going, Mike. Time to face the music." The ride to the courthouse was quiet, the tension palpable. William sat in the passenger seat, his walking stick resting across his lap. The cast on his leg throbbed slightly, but he paid it no mind. His thoughts were focused on what lay ahead. When they arrived, Mike hurried to help William out of the car. The courthouse loomed before them, its tall, imposing structure a stark contrast to the frailty of the man standing at his entrance. "You ready?" Mike asked. William gave a small nod, gripping his walking stick tightly. "I'm ready." As they made their way inside, William's deliberate steps echoed to the bustling space, each one a testament to his determination. He ignored the glances from passers-by, keeping his gaze steady and focused. Every step was a challenge. The cast forced William to move with deliberate slowness, and the uneven rhythm of his walking stick was a challenge. The cast forced William to move with deliberate slowness, and the uneven rhythm of his walking stick tapping against the stone steps echoed in the morning air. A few people passing by glanced at them, some with curiosity, others with quiet sympathy. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was busy yet subdued. Lawyers in sharp suits hustled past, briefcases in hand, while clerks shuffled papers at counters. The air buzzed with low murmurs and the occasional sharp ring of a phone. Amid the flurry of activity, William and Mike moved at their own measured pace, the sound of William's walking stick tapping on the tile floor, standing out like a metronome in the chaos. "Courtroom 3, Mike said, glancing at the notice board. "It's down this hall." William nodded, his breathing steady but heavy. The cast was cumbersome, and his leg throbbed with each step, but he kept his focus on the task ahead. He wasn't just here to fight a ticket. He was here to stand up for himself, and more importantly, for Mike. As they approached the courtroom, the whispers began. People turned their heads, their conversations faltering, as they noticed a frail, elderly man in a cast, dressed in a modest tweed jacket and leaning heavily on his walking stick. Mike, walking just as carefully beside him, looked equally worn but determined. "Who's that?" someone murmured from the bench near the door. "I don't know, but he looks like he's been through a lot," came the hushed reply. William ignored the stares, his gaze fixed on the wooden doors ahead. Mike, however, felt their weight. He glanced around briefly, his expression guarded, before returning his focus to his father. "You're doing great, Pop," Mike said quietly as they reached the doors. William gave a faint smile. "We're not there yet, Mike." Inside the courtroom was a mix of old-world grandeur and modern functionality. Wooden pews stretched in neat rows, the polished floors reflecting the light from high windows. At the front, the judge's bench stood tall and imposing, flanked by flags. William paused for a moment, taking it all in. The air was cooler here, the buzz of the courthouse replaced by a hushed anticipation. "You ready?" Mike asked, his voice low. William nodded, adjusting his grip on his walking stick. "Let's get this over with." Mike guided him to the defendant's table, where William eased himself into the chair. His leg, encasing the cast, was propped slightly on the small wooden footrest beneath the table. He let out a quiet sigh of relief, though his posture remained upright, his expression resolute. Mike moved to the audience section, taking a seat in the first row where he could still see his father clearly. His pale face betrayed his exhaustion, but his eyes were fixed on William with a mixture of concern and admiration. Around him the courtroom began to fill. Lawyers whispered to their clients. Papers shuffled, and the occasional cough punctuated the quiet. But William's presence continued to draw subtle attention. The combination of his age, his caste, and the calm determination etched into his face made it impossible for people not to notice him. "Do you know who he is?" Someone behind Mike whispered. "No idea, but he looks like he's got a story to tell," came the reply. William heard none of it. His focus was on the judge's bench, waiting for proceedings to begin. Despite the discomfort in his leg and the growing ache in his back, he sat tall, his hands resting on the table. The clerk entered, calling the courtroom to order. "All rise," she announced, her voice clear and commanding. William struggled to his feet, wincing as his casted leg protested. Mike immediately moved to help, but William waved him off with a slight shake of his head. "I've got it," he murmured. Judge Thomas Whitaker entered, a man in his early 80s with sharp eyes and an air of authority, softened by a kind expression. He took his seat, scanning the room briefly, before his gaze landed on William. For a moment his expression flickered with curiosity, but he quickly composed himself. "You may be seated," the judge said. William lowered himself back into his chair with a quiet grunt, adjusting his leg carefully. Mike returned to his seat, his gaze never leaving his father. The judge called the first case, and the courtroom fell into its usual rhythm. William listened with half an ear, his thoughts focused on what he would say when his turn came. He rehearsed the words in his mind, though he knew they would come from the heart when the time arrived. When the clerk announced Mr. William Hartman, the murmurs in the courtroom ceased. All eyes turned to the elderly man sitting at the defendant's table, leaning heavily on his walking stick. The cast on his leg and the care in his movement spoke volumes about the physical challenges he faced, yet his resolve was unmistakable. William placed his palms flat on the table, pushing himself up slowly, the effort visible in the tightening of his jaw. Mike, sitting in the front row of the audience, instinctively shifted forward, ready to help, but William shook his head with faint, reassuring smile. Judge Thomas Whitaker, seated high on the bench, watched William with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Mr. Hartman," the judge said, his voice carrying the calm authority of decades on the bench, "if you're in any discomfort, please let us know." William adjusted his glasses and nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor, but I'll manage." His tone was soft but firm, the determination behind it unyielding. The judge gestured for him to proceed. William took a moment to steady himself, leaning slightly on the stand. "Your Honor, I'm here today because I was given a speeding ticket. I've thought about that day over and over, and I still can't believe I'm standing here. At my age, driving fast isn't exactly something I'm capable of." A ripple of faint chuckles spread to the audience, quickly hushed. William's lips twitched into a small smile before he continued. "I've been driving for more than 70 years, Your Honor, and I can say without hesitation that safety has always been my priority, but that day my focus wasn't just on the road, it was on my son." He paused, his gaze shifting to Mike in the audience. "That's him sitting right there. Mike, he's my boy." Mike's pale face flushed slightly as he looked down at his hands, his expression a mix of pride and embarrassment. William adjusted his grip on the edge of the stand, his hands trembling slightly. "Mike has leukemia. He's been fighting it for years now, and it hasn't been easy. Every week we make the trip to the hospital for his treatments. I don't drive unless I have to. Your Honor, at my age is tiring, but I do it for him because he needs me." The courtroom was silent, the weight of William's words hanging in the air. "That day, we were running late to his appointment," William continued, his voice trembling slightly but gaining strength as he spoke. "I was worried that we'd miss his treatment, worried about what it would mean for his health. When the officer pulled me over, I tried to explain, but I guess it didn't matter." He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm not here to argue with the officer's decision. I respect the law, and I've lived my whole life trying to do what's right, but I wasn't driving recklessly. I'm just a father who will do whatever it takes to keep his son alive." William's voice broke slightly on the last word, and he paused to gather himself. He glanced at Mike again, drawing strength from the sight of the son sitting there, a quiet pillar of encouragement. "He's my boy," William repeated, his voice quieter now, but filled with emotion. He always has been, and he always will be. I made a promise to his mother before she passed that I'd take care of him, no matter what, and I intend to keep that promise for as long as I can. William's hand trembled as he reached for his walking stick, using it for support as he straightened his posture. I don't know how much longer I have left. I'm 96 years old. Every day I wake up, I thank God for another chance to take care of my son. But I'll keep doing it. I'll keep driving him to the hospital, no matter how hard it gets, because that's what fathers do. The judge leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful as he observed a man before him, the cast on William's leg. The deep lines etched into his face and the slight shake in his voice all told the story of a man who had carried more than his share of burdens. William inhaled deeply, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm not asking for pity or special treatment, Your Honor. I'm just trying to do right by my son. That's all I've ever wanted, to do right by him. He lowered his gaze for a moment, as if gathering the courage to finish. When he looked up again, his eyes were steady, filled with quiet resolve. Thank you for listening, Your Honor, he said simply. William carefully lowered himself back into his chair, his breathing slightly labored from effort. Mike watched him with admiration, his own eyes damp with unshed tears.
The courtroom remained silent for a long moment, the depth of William's testimony sinking in. People shifted in their seats, their expressions reflecting a mix of awe and respect. A woman in the back wiped at her eyes with a tissue, while a young man near the front whispered to his neighbor, "That's love right there." Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, his gaze never leaving William. The judge's years of experience had exposed him to countless stories, but this one struck a chord. "Mr. Hartman," the judge said after a pause, his tone soft but deliberate, "you've painted a picture of devotion and sacrifice that few can match. I want to thank you for sharing your story." William nodded slightly, his hands resting on his lap as he waited for the judge's decision. Around him the courtroom remained hushed, the weight of his words lingering in the air. It wasn't just his testimony that had moved them. It was the undeniable proof of a father's love, carried in every labored step and trembling word. William's eyes briefly flickered to Mike, who offered a small, proud smile. For William, that was enough. No matter the outcome, he had stood tall for his son, just as he always promised Eleanor he would. The courtroom was silent, as Judge Whitaker leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of the bench. His eyes softened as he looked at William, who sat at the defendant's table, his hands resting on his walking stick. The cast on his leg, the lines of exhaustion etched into his face, and the steady resolve in his posture painted a picture that lingered in the judge's mind. "Mr. Hartman," Judge Whitaker began, his tone measured but kind. "At your age, most people would be asking for help, not giving it. And yet here you are, taking care of your son, driving him to weekly treatments, and still showing up at this court appearance, even with a fractured leg." William raised his head slightly, meeting the judge's gaze with quiet humility. The judge's eyes briefly flicked to the cast on William's leg before returning to his face. His expression shifted, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You know, you're setting a bad example for the rest of us fathers," he said, his voice lightening. "Now my son will expect me to chauffeur him around when I'm 90, cast or no cast." The tension in the room dissolved as laughter rippled through the courtroom. It started as a few chuckles, but quickly spread, warming the air with its shared humanity. Even William allowed himself a small smile, his shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. Mike, seated in the front row of the audience, chuckled softly, shaking his head. His pride in his father was unmistakable, his pale face brighter with a momentary levity. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment, the depth of William's testimony sinking in. People shifted in their seats, their expressions reflecting a mix of awe and respect. A woman in the back wiped at her eyes with a tissue, while a young man near the front whispered to his neighbor, "That's love right there." Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, his gaze never leaving William. The judge's years of experience had exposed him to countless stories, but this one struck a chord. "Mr. Hartman," the judge said after a pause, his tone soft but deliberate, "you've painted a picture of devotion and sacrifice that few can match. I want to thank you for sharing your story." William nodded slightly, his hands resting on his lap as he waited for the judge's decision. Around in the courtroom remained hushed, the weight of his words lingering in the air. It wasn't just his testimony that had moved them. It was the undeniable proof of a father's love, carried in every labored step and trembling word. William's eyes briefly flickered to Mike, who offered a small, proud smile. For William, that was enough. No matter the outcome, he had stood tall for his son, just as he always promised Eleanor he would. The courtroom was silent, as Judge Whitaker leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of the bench. His eyes softened as he looked at William, who sat at the defendant's table, his hands resting on his walking stick. The cast on his leg, the lines of exhaustion etched into his face, and the steady resolve in his posture painted a picture that lingered in the judge's mind. "Mr. Hartman," Judge Whitaker began, his tone measured but kind. "At your age, most people would be asking for help, not giving it. And yet here you are, taking care of your son, driving him to weekly treatments, and still showing up at this court appearance, even with a fractured leg." William raised his head slightly, meeting the judge's gaze with quiet humility. The judge's eyes briefly flicked to the cast on William's leg before returning to his face. His expression shifted, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You know, you're setting a bad example for the rest of us fathers," he said, his voice lightening. "Now my son will expect me to chauffeur him around when I'm 90, cast or no cast." The tension in the room dissolved as laughter rippled through the courtroom. It started as a few chuckles, but quickly spread, warming the air with its shared humanity. Even William allowed himself a small smile, his shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. Mike, seated in the front row of the audience, chuckled softly, shaking his head. His pride in his father was unmistakable, his pale face brighter with a momentary levity.
The sun was warm as they stepped outside, the light casting long shadows on courthouse steps. William paused for a moment, looking up at the sky. He felt the weight of the day slowly lifting, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. "Thank you, Eleanor," he murmured under his breath, the words carried away by the gentle breeze. Mike, standing beside him, didn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. The look on William's face said everything. Together they made their way to the car, their steps slow but steady. For William, it wasn't just about winning the case. It was about standing tall for his son, for himself, and for the promise he had made so many years ago. As they drove away, the courthouse growing smaller in the rear-view mirror, William allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. For a day at least he had done enough, and for now that was all that mattered. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, please give this video a like. And now, that was all that mattered.